just start with a disclaimer. There's no way that this presentation can do justice to this section of the document or the topic in general. So I'm really just giving you a very quick overview, and the same with the looking at who is going to the synod. So let's get started so we can get on to also our great speakers tonight. I'm very excited about all this. So this is our session 3. This is our final session. It's on and we know that the synod is going to happen October 4th through 29th. And we know that there's going to be approximately 400 participants, 70 lay people, at least half of those are women. And as Russ said, the list of participants has been finalized, and it's out for all of us to see. And as I've noted before, the meeting has been moved to a larger venue, to the auditorium, which will be a much better space for the kinds of discussions, small group discussions that need to happen. So let's start with who's going to the synod now that we've got the list. So, and I focus on our US folks in the beginning here because there's just too many to focus on altogether. So in terms of our prelates, we have, you can just see the names. I'm not going to read every single name on all this list, but we know that the top 5 are chosen among themselves and from the USCCB, and then the bottom people are chosen by Pope Francis. So Cardinal Supich, Wilton Gregory, Robert McElroy, Sean O'Malley, Paul Etienne, James Martin, and Joe Tobin. They're all going, and we know that they're all friends of this idea of synodality, friends of the reforms that Francis is putting forward. So this is very good news. And then from the North American continent, well, actually, this is from the United States. These are the people who are going. We've got Cynthia Bailey-Mans, Richard Cole. I'll say a little bit more. Richard Cole's from the USCCB. Letizia Salazar is a chancellor in San Bernardino. Julia Oseka is a student in Philadelphia, St. Joseph, I think it is. Reverend Ivan Montalongo is a young priest. And then we've got 2 experts who are coming from the United States. And if you remember anything about Vatican II, there were experts all around helping people who were writing the documents, giving them sort of a theological background when they needed it to help them write what they needed to write. And we know that 84 women are listed in the list. 38 of those are women religious and 46 are lay women. So who's going to vote? And now I'm just focusing on women because it's brand new and so exciting. So we know that the Undersecretary of the Synod, Sister Natalie, will be voting. And she has been a major force in bringing this notion of synodality to the fore. She's studied it at Boston College and other places, but she has been a major force for women, and it's been really, really good to see that happen. So we know that in prior years, the 10 religious superiors were all male. This year we have 5 who are women, and here are their names. And you can see that where they're from, what their backgrounds are. I couldn't find, if I don't have a picture, it's because I couldn't find one right now. So that's, but this is new, different, and good. So of the 10 people who are religious superiors, 5 are now representing. And actually one of the religious sisters from the UISG said, actually we ought to have more because there's, proportionally, there are many more religious sisters than there are brothers. But anyway, that's the way it goes. And then who will vote? We've got Sister Maria Dolores Palencia, who's a delegate, and Miss Mamonko Nikamura. I'm not even going to try to name them. The Pope appointed some of the women, and here are their names, and here are some of their pictures, and you can see They all have, quite enormous backgrounds, very good for the job that they will be undertaking. We have more of the pictures of the people who will be going, the president's delegates, the people that Pope Francis appointed, and you can see here what their backgrounds are. And from Africa, we have some really important people. We know Sheila Russ. She's communications for the South African Bishops Conference. The first African woman to be a member of the International Theological Commission will be there. We have an ethicist from Ghana. If I don't have something in here, it's because I couldn't find it yet. And we have a theologian and the director for the Center of Protection of Minors and Vulnerable Persons in the Ivory Coast. So again, in terms of what we need from this synod, these are really top-notch women. Who will vote in North America? We've got Miss Cynthia Bailey Mand. She's a professor and she's also the director of adult learning at St. Joan of Arc Catholic Community. Ms. Catherine Clifford is a professor at St. Paul University in Ottawa. Sister Chantal Desmarais is the director of the Oasis of Prayer. She's an interesting person. She owns 2 karate studios and plays hockey. There's pictures of her with her mask on. Really cool. And this Julia Oseka is the student at St. Joseph in Philly, and she has been on record saying that she wants inclusion of LGBTQI people and women's participation. Sister Salazar is the chancellor at San Bernardino, and Ms. Linda Stout is the former director of the Catholic School Board in London, Ontario. Who's going to vote in Latin America? We have an author who wrote a history of the devotion to Mary. We have a sister from the province of Medellin. We have the president of the National Council of the Laity. She's at the top left in Brazil. And then the rest I haven't had a chance to actually finish up the look at who they are. Who's going to vote in Asia? You see we have a theologian from Hong Kong, someone from Myanmar, the local youth ministry person from Sophia University, and then the executive secretary of the Office of Theological Concerns at the Asian Bishops Conference. So, and she's also a consultant on base ecclesial communities for the bishops in the Philippines. So again, we have quite a cast going. Okay. And then the list of the people from the Oriental churches in the Middle East, they were very hard to find. So I think in some cases, there's good reasons around that because they're doing some pretty important and scary work. But I will continue to do some research, but for now, these are the women, but I couldn't find much information about them yet. We'll vote from Europe. Again, I have more work to do here, but we have some professors, some sisters. And from Oceania, we have, again, some professors, more work to do here in terms of who these folks are. But again, we have, it's very exciting to see these women. They're 54 will be voting, and they come with very diverse and very, important backgrounds to help us move toward a synodal church. And then there are women who are special guests that won't be voting, and as spiritual assistants who will be there. And then we have a whole list of experts and facilitators that I have listed here that are women who will be going. And the general secretariat of the synod are the women involved in that are these women. So what will the Synod participants discern in October? We've gone over this, but I just want to review it just very quickly. They'll go over section A, which will be what are the fundamentals of being a synodal church. Section B is the section on communion, co-responsibility and mission, participation, governance, and authority, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. And they're at the end of the last part of the synod will be them gathering the fruits, making up and deciding what are going to be the practical next steps. And so they'll be reflecting theologically on certain ideas. They'll be looking at canon law, what has to happen. And the main objective, again, is to create basically a path for 2024 with more study and deciding what actually needs to be talked about in 2024 in order to bring the synodal church forward. So when it comes to participation and governance and authority, the main question is what processes and structures and institutions do we need for a missionary synodal church? So key ideas. So we talked about before, communion and mission are the top priorities. That's what counts. And mission comes first and communion is how it happens. But participation is how we make it a reality in the world. And so participation is an expression of creativity. It's a way of nurturing relationships of hospitality, welcome, human well-being. And participation within that, there's a call for renewed language and appreciation of the culture of the local church. So as we saw in the synod, there was a talk about a rite that would be particular. Now that hasn't gone forward yet, but we're getting ready for that kind of diversity within our church. Well, we have it to some degree, but I think the idea is to go even further. So renewed language in liturgy, preaching, catechesis, sacred art. We need more understandings from our art than the European white Jesus and white Mary. There is a diversity in that art. And then we need all forms of communication to be diverse and have renewed language. And it's basically the idea is that language is welcoming. It makes everyone feel a part of it. It doesn't act as a barrier to anyone. Key ideas about authority. It emerges from integral participation. Authority is not top down in a synodal church. It comes from all of us together, our discerning together. And it's shared authority. It's not a form of power over, but it's rooted in service. It enables other people to grow around us. It enables creativity. It doesn't stifle us. These are ideas that are in the document. So how do we build a synodal church? We need changes in attitudes. So formation for everybody, from the bishops down to all lay people. We need changes in structures. How do parish councils work? Could they work better? And we need changes in canon law. So the questions for the synodal participants is, so I just laid them all out here, and you can see some of the highlights. How to renew the service of authority. So how do we bring service back into this idea of authority? How do we develop discernment practices? What structures need to be developed? Can we give structure to instances of synodality and collegiality? There's a whole set of structure that needs to take place if we're going to have bishops' conferences talking together on a continental way. We need to have structures that support that. And how can the institution of the synod be strengthened so that it can be an expression of episcopal collegiality within an all synodal church? Big question. And so here are some of the key tensions. Baptism is the foundation for all ministry, but, and this is in the document, ordained ministry is different from other ministries. Authority in consecrated life and movements and associations, etc., is different from the authority that derives from the sacrament of orders. Spiritual authority is linked to charism, and it's different from that linked to ministerial service. And the differences must be safeguarded. So if you read through the document, you can see the tension between sort of the people who want the church to remain a very hierarchical institution and those that want to see a much more round, a much more level playing field in terms of all the people that are involved. And what it does say is that, and what I love about this document, what I think is hopeful is no one is trying to cover up the tensions. We're just going to let them be. They're there. If we're going to be a whole church, there are these tensions. But then there are these examples of how already among these tensions, there is this emerging synodality. So, for instance, the experience of relevant authority taking a decision within a synodal process made the community more ready to accept its legitimacy. So when everybody has buy-in, a decision becomes more legitimate within the community. There's a growing awareness that the lack of healthy exchange within the community weakens the role of authority. So when you have someone just sort of laying down rules, ignoring the will of or the spirit of the people, it's not healthy. It's not synodal, and people are starting to recognize that. And then they talk about this, and it doesn't say it specifically, but this is where Ellie has just been, and we know the Amazon Synod was there a couple years ago, in a region where the number of priests is very, very low. The ecclesial responsibilities have been entrusted to lay faithful who exercise them in a constructive and non-oppositional manner. So we already have it taking place in certain regions of the world, and I'm sure Father Joe will talk about how that happens in his part of the world as well. Some key questions about workforce and structures. How, and this is a really important question, because this is not going away, how does the shortage of priests provide an incentive to question the relationship between ordained ministry, governance, and the assumption of responsibilities in the Christian community? We know that this, as this number of priests goes down, we have to think of other ways to be church together. And it can't be closing down the Catholic Church. It just can't be that. So synodality is going to open up those possibilities. And how can synodality renew existing structures, such as diocesan, parish pastoral councils, economic affair councils, or do we need to establish new ones if the authority structure doesn't work well and discernment structure doesn't work well? And how can we learn from public institutions, public and civil law, to respond to the need for transparency and accountability, separations of powers, independent supervisory bodies, obligations to make public certain procedures, limits on durations of appointments? How can the church learn from that so that we can create a more authentic, more accepted, more plausible leadership for Catholics? And then there are some key questions in canon law. What changes in canon law are needed to facilitate synodal discernment? How do we rebalance the relationship between the principle of authority, which is already strongly affirmed in current legislation, and the principle of participation? We know something has to shift in order to really create a truly synodal church where authority is shared, where discernment is shared. How should canonical structures and pastoral procedures change to foster co-responsibility and transparency? How can canon law contribute to the renewal of structures and institutions? And how can engagement at the continental level be integrated into canon law? So as we're seeing the church talk together more and more, but also decide at the local level, we need canon law to support that. And so that's it for me for tonight.
Thanks, Deb, so much, especially for all that groundwork, trying to figure out who some of these folks who are attending goes. I know that's tough work, and it's a gift that you've given to all of us. Thank you. All right, and with that,
Russ, just to say that I will, we'll put that PowerPoint up, and so at least if nothing else, people can pull down who the women are, and so have an easy reference. So.
Great, thanks, Deb. Yeah. All right, and at this point, I'd like to bring on Sister Lynn Jarrell to address some of those questions that Deb wrapped up with.
Okay, now I was given 10 minutes, which is not much. So you just know I'm going to jump all over, which is not also a good way to do this. I was asked to talk about what has developed with canon law since Vatican II. So I'll start there for just a brief moment, and then I'll go to the Synod. A Vatican II Council and the revision of the Code of Canon Law were called for on the same day by Pope John the 23rd. So the Council and the revision of Code of Canon Law are linked directly. And the revision process of the code only came and was completed about 15 years after the council ended. Now, my point for sharing that with you is that the canons law in the church follows the theology. So most of those questions that Deb were reading off to you about what canon law ought to do and ought to do and ought to do, it's really the theology has to change as well as our understanding of it, and then the structures will follow. So it's not, sometimes we point so easily at change the law and that'll change everything, and it really won't change anything. Following that through, I'll just say the 1983 code has a lot more in it than ever was in canon law before. Principles, values, and room to expand and change. There's been many examples of that as recently as the Curia in the Vatican was reorganized again as a result of the new Code of Canon Law. The big word I pull out of it, which comes from Vatican II, is the law speaks of the people of God are the Christian faithful. Either one, they're synonyms in the code, and therefore that follows directly from the Vatican II documents. Now, moving from there to the question that was asked to me, how can canon law help us move towards a more authentically synodal church, especially in terms of lay involvement and decision-making? Let me emphasize for you again, theology and magisterium have to change. That includes attitudes and formation, which Deb hit very strongly, and I will too if I get that far in not 10 minutes. But when that changes, then the legal norms naturally follow, either by being adapted practically or by a formal promulgation by the church. So the issue is really, what does the term more authentically synodal church? And I have to say to you, in all my study, there is no clarity about what synodality is. And I would say in reading the documents in preparation for this synod, there is no clarity. However, it does land very clearly on the process of sharing your prayer or your discernment, listening, and seeing what then emerges from that sharing, listening for the good of the whole. That's a good process. It is not historically going to highly change the structures until it influences the theology that goes with that. I can take you through a number of pieces there, but because of time, I'll skip over it to say that the main reason that synodality or synodal church has emerged in our time is because of the experience of the bishops of the world in preparation as well as during the 3 years of Vatican II. It was first time there was a real spirit of dialogue and a sense of honest searching for healthy pastoral solutions to problems. And so the bishops of the world, at least a lot of them, certainly not all of them, said there could be value in continuing a synodal process. The council itself was a synodal process, but more of an ongoing kind of a periodical one, which resulted in the brand new structure started by Paul VI by a motu proprio, a document he issued in 65 to create the Synod of Bishops. And then there was a follow-up document to that, and then it was incorporated into the actual Code of Canon Law. However, and again, this is the part I've got to really skip through, and I trust you've done some reading on this, the various experiences of the Synod of the Bishops has clearly moved it, especially John Paul II, moved it very clearly that the Synod of Bishops is an arm of the Pope, not a collegial gathering of the bishops, as the Vatican Council was. And that is where we're at this point on the understanding. And our current Pope, even in his writings, even in the document that Deb was taking you through, continues to accent that by such a statement, which maybe you came upon it in number 48. It's also been issued by the Pope at other times, Francis. It says, a synodal assembly cannot be understood as representative and legislative, analogous to a parliamentary structure with its dynamics of majority building. Always, there must be an emphasis on what the Holy Spirit brings to our attention and not decided by majority vote. Now, we with our mindset, at least in this part of the world, for one of us on this Zoom that are from this part of the world, we have a hard time with that because we very much carry that sense of conversation, decision-making ought to be done by the whole. And that is not what the structure is about. That would be true of all the synodal practices in the church, the ones that Deb named, that are in dioceses, that are in parishes, that are in religious communities. In most all those cases, those groups are consultative, and then the one that has the ultimate authority makes the decision. A little bit different in women's religious groups, but by and large, there's still some of that even there. Now, let me go to the next question that she raised for me, Deb. It was in 43 in the document, and it's this question of whether canon law can really help us rebalance things or make a difference. Actually, that statement is not saying that canon law has to be totally revised. It says that the theology and the canon law needs to follow and try to develop in light of the insights that groups come up with. It names that the call is to examine how the Spirit may lead the church to grow, giving valid expression to communion, mission, and participation. Those are considered constitutive elements of the nature of the church: communion, mission, and participation. You can't just land on one of them, participation. It's all three of them, and how are they developing and being understood, and then possible canonical changes can follow. The tension around synodality on this question, as well as in other parts around the Synod of the Church, really comes back to what happened even at the Council of Jerusalem way back in the New Testament times, between authority and consensus. The tension has been heightened by Vatican II, calling for the universal call to holiness. And one of Deb's slides talked about the baptism of the Christian faithful, and why is it different that the ordained have more authority, even though it's the same baptism. So that tension has been there, and the vagueness of synodality, as well as the synod of the bishops, the description of it, has led to some of the confusion, or even the call that the norms need to replace vertical authority, which is the synod of bishops, to horizontal authority, which is the Christian faithful. And I would say that's probably a heart of the tension that many of us on this would experience. And just in case you have any doubts, I don't necessarily support all these things that it's vertical or what have you, but I'm telling you what the canonical norms are. Synodality cannot get into functional. It has to focus on the theological and the core teachings of the church in order to make a difference. And at times, even some of the questions that are in the document and maybe the conversations I hear, it's like, we got to change this, or we got to look at this, or how can canon law, that's functional versus what is at the heart of what we believe, and then how can we express that in our actions. Now, I'm sure I'm way over, Russ, and I probably should stop. Do you want me to stop or do one more thing?
Sure, yeah, if you've got one more thing, go for it.
Okay, there was a question that asked me, and I'll try to combine this one. It says, how can we imagine, these are questions out of the document that Deb gave me, how can we imagine decision-making processes that are more participatory? And then it also goes on to say, how can the church live with more co-responsibility and transparency? I spent a huge part of my life, and I'm very grateful I got to do it, but teaching in seminaries, major seminaries. At the heart of any long-term change and how the church will operate has to be a change in the formation of the seminarians. From the first day they walk in, they are good people. They are very committed. The staff and faculties are very committed. But the thrust is that they are on a different path than the rest of the Christian faithful. and how to shift that and develop that formation into seeing we're all part of the same Christian faithful. That is the only way I can imagine synodality in a practical way, making changes that are significant, and also bringing about more co-responsibility so that we can move more into a formation that's for the ongoing. And it's not just in seminary formation, but like Deb said, she said, I think you said formation, formation, formation. So it's all of us. And by and large, most Catholics don't like ongoing formation. We stop it at high school, maybe college, maybe sometimes in adult ed, but we all need to have more formation, but especially those with the authority. Okay, I'll stop, Russ.
Great. Thank you so much, Sister. All right. And with that, we'll turn things over to Father Joe Healey.
Good day, wherever you are. First, I'd like to thank the folks at FutureChurch, our leaders, and yourselves for wanting to hear the African context. Truly, we are a world church. We are a synodal church. We are guided by the Holy Spirit. As an expatriate American missionary priest, I should not be presenting. Rather, Africans themselves should make this presentation. But it's 2 a.m. in Nairobi, Kenya right now, so they can't be with us. But I have prepared these reflections in a synodal way and gathered the views and voices of many African laywomen, laymen, religious priests, and bishops. I would like to begin by building on what Sister Lynn Jarrell said on canon law. This is the heart of the synodal process in a spiritual conversation and dialogue. It fits perfectly with tonight's theme of participation, governance, and authority. In 2022, leaders of the synodal process in Africa met in a Zoom session with Cardinal Gresh. In the question and answer period, an African layman asked the Cardinal how African lay people can participate more in the Catholic Church. The Cardinal answered immediately, be active members of your parish pastoral councils, which we call PPCs, and diocesan pastoral councils, we call them DPCs. And Deb referred to them a lot in her presentation. This is not a given. In Eastern Africa, 90% of our parishes have PPCs. But in the US, as an example, in Newark Archdiocese in New Jersey, only 50% of the parishes have parish pastoral councils. In some countries in Europe, it is less. Gresh said that the 1983 Code of Canon Law needs updating, and Lynn referred to that. Right now, 2 canon lawyers in his synod office in Rome are drafting proposed changes to make PPCs mandatory. They are only recommended now and more representative. This is not easy. I was in Rome at the beginning of the synod on young people in 2018. The synod delegates recommended that each parish pastoral council have 1 young woman and 1 young man. Has this happened? In many countries, it has not. Gresh said that the PPC should have deliberative powers in certain cases. This has not happened. The parish priest remains king in his parish. The bishop remains king in his diocese. One small Christian community lay leader in Nairobi said, we lay people are the victims of the next parish priest that comes along. I can give some examples of how the PPCs can have more deliberate decision-making powers in the Q&A period. In describing the various images of the Catholic Church, the working document states, and I quote, Africa suggested that the image of the Church as the family of God is capable of offering belonging and welcome to all its members in all their variety, end of quote. Sister Magdalena Chumbwa from Tanzania says that we already have the synodal process in Africa through our African community values and our small Christian communities. It's easy. It's a piece of cake, she says. And she goes on, in Africa, we have been exercising the themes of the Synod, community, participation, and mission for years. A strong unity and communion built from the family level to all the levels of the local church have allowed people to participate fully during this synodal process. We have openly shared experience about mission of the Catholic Church in their ordinary life. End of quote. I'm going to talk about communion ecclesiology, which Lynn referred to, the importance of theology. In communion ecclesiology, we begin at the grassroots with the family as the domestic church. The small Christian community is the communion of families. The outstation is the communion of SCCs. The parish is the communion of outstations. The diocese is the communion of parishes. And the National Bishops' Conference is the communion of dioceses. This is communion ecclesiology, a foundation for change. The small Christian community or base community is the official ecclesial pastoral structure in many countries in Africa. In the 9 countries of Eastern Africa where I served, there are 195 SCCs. Yes, 195. An SCC is a small neighborhood parish-based group in an urban or rural area that is a pastoral model of church that transforms the parish into a community of communities and is an instrument of evangelization. Ideally, it is weekly lectionary-based faith sharing that reflects on the gospel of the following Sunday and connects to our daily lives and regular practical action, social outreach. Cardinal-elect Protas Rugambwa of Tabora, Tanzania, one of the newly appointed cardinals, says, we need to always think of SCCs as relevant pastoral structures that foster the work of evangelization. Another bishop in Tanzania said in his diocese, the entire pastoral work will be carried out by means of small Christian communities. Father Emmanuel Chiombo of the Yamasei office in Nairobi says that small Christian communities can act as a counterbalance to the culture of individualism that has crept into the Catholic Church. Feedback from lay people is critical in reawakening the spirituality of SCCs to empower local leaders. SCC members are trained to identify the needs of their neighbors, not just fellow Catholics, becoming in the process a neighborhood church. Unfortunately, and I repeat that word, unfortunately, this is not brought out in the working document that only describes SCCs as lay-led groups. Yet, at a press conference in Rome on Friday, 20th April, Sister Natalie presented the report of the Synodal Continental Task Force and emphasized, and I quote, the strong experience of small Christian communities, base ecclesial communities in Asia, Africa, and Oceania is an experience of synodality. Now I'm going to talk about one of my favorite people, Sister Jose Ngalula of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we saw her picture in Deb's presentation. She's the only woman on the International Theological Commission. In the webinar on synodality in Africa in 2021, she emphasized the importance of the structure of small Christian communities on the grassroots level. She said, and I quote, we have to use and consolidate this basic structure to help us listen to the people of God, especially laymen and laywomen. SCC is an ecclesial model of the Catholic Church in Africa. The new language is spiritual conversation, mutual listening, and prayerful discernment. SCCs represent the spirit of synodality and the synodal process. In the contextual process, African theologians, and I'm going back to the theology that Lynn referred to, must be involved in the real problems of Africa. Ngalula points out, theological research and publications must be linked to the present life of the church in Africa. Africa theologians must be attentive to the ways African Christians can try to live their faith in Jesus Christ and strive to give evangelical responses to the question raised in their own context, especially in small Christian communities. Alois Nyakundi, a young adult leader in Kenya, feels that we have to involve youth and young adults more in the synodal process. This means using the internet and social media. We have a saying, go digital or die. He gives examples of St. Augustine alumni SCC at Kenyatta University in Nairobi that gathers weekly in a hybrid way, both in person and online. And the online young adult seeker small Christian community. I end with two important books published by Orbis. First is this book, Walking Together, The Way of Synodality by Pope Francis. The introduction is by Cardinal Gresh, and the foreword is by Sister Natalie. And the second book is called Synodality in Africa, edited by 4 authors, including Jose Ngalula, who we've talked about already. Finally, I'd like to share what expresses through an African proverb the spirit and practice of synodality. If you want to walk fast, walk alone. If you want to walk far, walk together. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Father Joe. And let's move right along here, and I'll turn things over to Ellie.
Thank you, Deb and Russ, for this opportunity to be here tonight. And I am very happy to be with all of you tonight. And also want to thank Sister Lynn and Father Joe. Very helpful to hear your remarks. So at Discerning Deacons, which I'm co-directing, we're engaging Catholics in the active discernment of our church about women and the diaconate. And this is a historic time to grow the conversation during the Global Synod. And so I've traveled to the Amazon region of Latin America twice. Last September, I was in Bolivia and Riberalta. And this June, I was in Porto Velho, Brazil. And I also traveled to Caripuna Indigenous Territory. So that's what my Deb asked my remarks to focus on today. What am I learning about synodality from this experience? So my colleague and Discerning Deacons co-director, Casey Stanton, and I, we wanted to travel to the Amazon this summer because we wanted to understand better how women are already serving as de facto permanent deacons in the Amazon, and why the Amazon bishops have been publicly in favor of including women in the diaconate and recognizing and stabilizing and ordering the vital ministries that women are providing. So we spent a week with Franciscan Sister Laura Vicuña, who was recently appointed Vice President of SEAMA. It's a brand new ecclesial body in the Amazon that includes clergy, women, and lay people in leadership in decision-making roles. And this is historic because most conferences are bishops' conferences, but now in the Amazon, there's an ecclesial conference, and it's even referenced in the Instrumentum Laboris on page 59. So one of the things I learned from being in the Amazon is that increasingly there's a vision for the renewal of the diaconate. In the US, most permanent deacons are involved in liturgical roles. Most parishioners see their deacons providing service at the altar. But what emerges in the Amazon is a vision for the renewal of the permanent diaconate that is a prophetic diaconate that includes men and women for a synodal church that goes out to the peripheries. So I'll just say that again, because I know I said a lot in a few words. It's a vision for a prophetic diaconate that includes men and women for a synodal church that goes out to the peripheries. So I want to unpack this a little bit from what I saw. So prophetic diaconate, what does this mean? So in the Amazon in particular, there's a huge effort now to call the world to the attention around care of our common home. So Sister Laura in particular has worked with CIMI for more than 20 years. It's the Brazilian Bishops Indigenous Missionary Council, because what you find is that in the Amazon, the people most committed to integral ecology are indigenous communities, and they're making huge sacrifices in terms of, there are even threats and persecution by people who would want to log, mine, set up cattle grazing, and deforest the land in the Amazon. So they need the support of the church, and this Indigenous Missionary Council actually helps Indigenous groups to access the courts to prevent illegal deforestation or mining. They accompany, Sister Laura has accompanied the Caribuna people to visit multiple embassies represented in Brazil to pressure other countries to ensure that human rights of Indigenous people and land rights are preserved. And one of the things Sister Laura told me is, we can't renew the church if we don't also renew our common home. The best contribution we can make from the Amazon is to call the world to care for our common home. And while we were there, we could really see the tension. In Caribuna territory, the forest was lush, it was dense. We were seeing toucan birds flying around, thousands of butterflies in the height of the butterfly season. And as soon as we were out of Caribuna territory, you began to see burnt trees, deforestation, cattle grazing, and you could really see the tension between the vibrancy of an alive forest versus the desolation of deforestation. Now, the diaconate, part of the vision in the Amazon is that the diaconate would include men and women. So just to give you a picture of why this is so important, Porto Velho, the Archdiocese of Porto Velho, has 32 priests. The Archdiocese is about the size of Indiana, which has over 700 priests. So in the Amazon, it's all hands on deck, including men, women, priest, bishop, deacon, religious women, lay women. Everyone needs to contribute their part to be able to sustain the faith in very rural areas. And so there's a desire to be able to offer the diaconate to women who have that vocation and to be able to offer formation and order the diaconal service, make it a more stable ministry. So once again, the vision of the diaconate would be for a synodal church. Many diaconal women are the ones that are helping to implement the charism, what's being asked for us in a synodal church, to create spaces of encounter, listening, dialoguing, discerning the will of the Holy Spirit, making decisions. There's been a huge effort during the synodal process to go out to the peripheries and listen to Indigenous peoples, African heritage people, the poor, women, and to make sure that their voices have been included in this process. And there's also this question of how do decisions get made more synodally, specifically with regards to women's leadership. There is a history of things getting constructed and then processes get interrupted or are allowed to die on the vine or actively deconstructed. I think we've had those experiences in the US as well. For example, where lay preaching may actually be constructed in some area, a robust formation for laity or women functioning as de facto deacons, and then maybe later on that gets deconstructed. So there's a real need, and I think one of the things people are really hoping for from this global synod is that the world can really begin to discern, how do we make women's leadership more stable so that we're not constantly constructing and deconstructing things, but have more of a vision for what women's leadership can look like. And the diaconate could be one area where it would be historic for the church to restore that vocation. And then finally, a prophetic diaconate goes out to the peripheries. So once again, it's like returning the diaconate to its original charism in Acts 6, where deacons were appointed because widows were being left out of the distribution of the food. And so deacons, as people who are being called to serve those on the margins, and many people at the margins are women and children who could be well served by a woman deacon. And now we also need to think about our common home as being very much at the margins of our care and in need of both men and women, everyone doing everything possible to preserve our planet for abundant life and for future generations of people. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellie. That's great. I'm going to bring everyone onto the screen here so that you can see everyone. And if you give me just a minute, I will give folks the ability to unmute themselves. But if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, if you could use the reaction button down at the bottom of your Zoom window. It looks like a little emoji, a little smiley face with a plus. And then if you click that button, there's another button that asks you to raise your hand. And that's how I'll know that you have a comment or a question to make. Let me just get Sister Lynn up here. And I got to press one more button. And here we go. Margaret Mary Moore, let me bring you up onto the screen. You'll just have to unmute. There we go.
Myself. Yes, I would like to ask a question about canon law, and that is there's a situation, every diocese has a promoter of justice, and there's a situation with one person who was banned from a school. Lies were told about her. The pastor went along with it. So did the person accusing her. And then the auxiliary bishop stepped in, found out it was all lies. But then her reputation has not been cleared. And I know canon law says a layperson everybody has a right to their reputation. And and she's banned from the properties.
Oh, I think we may have lost Margaret.
Well, let me answer in general. Is that okay?
Sure. Yes, please. Thank you.
Margaret Mary, I have much sympathy for the situation. I know it's painful and difficult. It's very, very hard to untangle those things, especially reestablishing people's reputation. So I would urge that the person, she, continue to work through whatever church processes are available in that diocese. And if that's not satisfactory, then why don't he or she find a canonist that would help her pursue that. But that's a very delicate issue that really has to be handled individually. And the person has a right to reports.
All right. Thanks, Sister Lynn. Let's see here. Pat McCloskey, I don't think I can bring you up on screen because I don't have your video, but go ahead and ask your question. You'll just have to unmute. Pat, can you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, just an observation that of the 70 people,
I'm on there now if you don't.
Oh, let's see. Folks, if you're not asking a question, please stay on mute. Go ahead, Pat.
Of the 70 people appointed by the Pope, all of them were active in the consultations at the diocesan, national, or continental level. This may not be known to everybody in this group, but that is the case.
Okay, yep. Thank you, Pat. Anyone care to elaborate or comment further on that?
I think I agree with that. I've noticed a lot of overlap. So thanks, Pat, for pointing that out.
All right, let's see. I'm gonna get more hands coming up here. Janet McLaughlin, let me bring you up on screen.
Thank you. I'm from Columbus, Ohio. And just a comment to Ellie that I was in the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador, on the eastern Ecuador, close to Peru. And everything you said about the logging, the mining, and the cattle, exactly. So I thank you so much. Thank you so much for working on that. And then I just want to say I've done work in El Salvador, and maybe this relates to what Joseph was saying, is that I was in a community in El Salvador where there were no priests but nuns, and the nuns danced for us and brought up the spirit from the earth. And I have never felt the spirit of Christ more than I felt it in El Salvador through the nuns. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks so
Janet.
much, Janet. Oh, go ahead, Ellie.
One of the things I wanted to remark, and I appreciate your also being able to witness what's happening in the Amazon. I mean, part of what's so devastating is that there's such an emphasis from multinational companies for short-term profits. And so this often leads to, logging too much, mining in a way that poisons rivers for indigenous communities that are right next to the mining, or cattle grazing that burns the pastures every year and releases so many toxins into the air. Often this is all done to return a profit to investors within 10 years of a project. There could be other ways of doing things that would sustain the land, but that would require a real change of heart for us to focus on how do we use land in a way that's sustainable and preserves it for future generations.
Great, thanks, Janet. Thanks, Ellie. All right, we've got Ray. Let me get you up on screen here. Ray Temmerman, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thanks, Sister Lynn. I really appreciate the focus on the theology first and the canon law second. My question is that is on ecumenism. B14 is full of the term, but beyond that, it almost doesn't exist. And my research has been in Canada and Australia. In Canada, we now have more marriages between a Catholic and a person of another Christian tradition than we have between two Catholics. In Australia, 35% of all marriages are a Catholic with a person of another Christian tradition. It seems to me that we have here a huge cohort of people of other Christian traditions which are part of the church and a rich resource for ecumenical activity. And yet, other than B14, we see nothing of ecumenism. And I'm just wondering whether or not the church is actually looking at that beyond this small group.
I can say something, Russ. I don't have a solid response for you, Ray, but what I can say is Vatican II, the council, in its writings in several places, called for much more expansion of ecumenism in the church and connecting with other faith lives and all. The code that followed, Code of Canon Law, also emphasized that, but it's a perfect example of you can say something in a document, you can even urge it in a canonical norm, but if there's no energy or formation again to pursue it, it doesn't carry any weight. And that's why I'm not a person to promote that we create more synodal or consultation processes. It's more like, let's work with the ones we have. So that would be my best answer. But I do know that ecumenism is not dead. It's not like it's out. It's just that there aren't people with a lot of energy for it overall. Certainly like when certain places there are.
Maybe I could add, at the African continental meeting, we had delegates from the fraternal churches. We even had atheists come from West Africa, and there was a whole section on ecumenism and interreligious dialogue. But unfortunately, from that one African experience, it didn't get into the working document.
And see, it's situational there for you, Joseph. It's really critical even to survive in your culture because of all the mixing of religions. So you're right. It's a good example of a situation driving the development like there where you are.
Great, good question, Joe. Thank you. All right, Frank Manning, let me get you up on screen here. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question, Frank. Frank, you're still muted. There you go.
Is it working now?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. In the United States, due in part to the shortage of priests, instead of having small Christian communities, we're having mega churches. We're closing parishes all over the place and replacing them with these very large churches with all the detriments that we have. And my question really is, you know, with these parishes of 2,000, 4,000 families and so on, what would they look like if we incorporate small Christian communities? And also, I'd like to relate this to the issue of ecumenism. I think if we're going to make progress in that area, we really need the small Christian communities because they're an ideal kind of thing to generate kind of energy that you're talking about of interacting with other churches to have meaningful progress. So that's the issue I wanted to raise. Thanks.
If I could begin, I think we have to be creative in the Catholic Church and borrow good ideas from the evangelical churches, because their model of the mega churches is they have these small faith sharing communities during the week. And it's that idea that I brought out of communion ecclesiology. The parish is a communion of these small faith sharing communities. So we have to have what I call both and.
And I could add something to this. I had the opportunity to attend one of these small faith communities while I was in Porto Velho, and it was very vibrant and alive, and they had good formation for the lay people who were leading it, and occasionally a priest would come to offer a Eucharistic celebration. And then one of the religious sisters I talked to, Sister Teresinha, she had been part of developing a model of a formation center that provided formation for these small Christian communities. And there was like a hub of 10 of them in a particular geographic area. The mega churches is not going to be possible in places that are rurally very disparate, for example, in the Amazon. But the model of the base communities is really vibrant. And I think that those of us in the US really do have a lot to learn from what's happening in Africa and in Latin America. And the more stories we can share, the better, because you know, we need to be thinking about, as parishes close and consolidate, what are other models of sustaining the faith here in the US?
And I'll just add briefly, there is nothing in canon law that prevents small faith communities, what have you, through the weeks or whatever. It's again back to that formation of understanding the value of people worshiping that way.
Oh. All right, thanks, Frank. Very good question and some good conversation. All right, let's see. We've got maybe a couple more minutes here. That if we can stretch this just a little bit. Let's bring Rita up onto the screen. We'll try to get through as many of these questions as we can.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. It's great to see Ellie, and nice to hear Lynn and Joseph. I have an observation, and then I have I guess a significant question. The observation is, I think I heard Joseph say that the small Christian communities use the Sunday lectionary as the base for discussion and prayer and discernment. And that heightens to me the essential need to expand the Catholic Sunday lectionary, which excludes, 90 to 80% of the women leaders. That puts more urgency behind that project. But the second most important thing I wanted to ask was, Lynn, in terms of theology driving change to canon law, I'm trying to imagine, I'm not a canon lawyer, I'm trying to imagine what that what did it look like in Vatican II? What could it look like here? What are the mechanisms? How can individuals get involved in it? That's my question.
Trying to take it in there, Rita, and see what you're really going for. Everything that we're speaking about that came out like with the 1983 code, but even the Synod of Bishops, is all a fruit of Vatican II. So what you need to be really grounded in is the whole spirit of Vatican II, which we have never yet fully activated. It always takes at least 100 years for a council to be fully implemented. And this is certainly going to take that long with this one, it looks like, unfortunately. So you got to go back to the Vatican II spirit, and the right after the Vatican II spirit, the first 10, 15 years, especially with Paul VI, was an effort to try to really bring it into full expression. That's my best answer for you. I'd really like to explore that further with you, but I suspect there's more underneath that for me to understand what you're asking.
And Rita, if I could add, the women here are much better to answer this question, but I'm a great advocate to push on the dicastery of liturgy to reintroduce some of these women saints. My favorite is Phoebe. She was knocked out.
Yes.
Ellie knows that. We've got to fight for those
Yes.
women to be back in the liturgy, and all of us to really celebrate Mary Magdalene later this month. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for that plug for St. Phoebe, whose feast day is on September 3rd. So that's also coming.
Another missionary deacon, sent, to Rome to deliver the letter to the Romans. All right, we've got one more. I think we've got time for one more quick question, and I'll bring you up onto the screen here, Marianne McLean. Go ahead and ask your question.
It's more a comment than a question. I was blown away, shall we say, by Father Joe's and the other lady who was in the Amazon, their presentation of how communities worked essentially to support and develop the faith in so many ways. I think, though, we're talking about small communities, often interrelated perhaps, and not the mass market North American communities that many of us here belong to. So to me, I think we can learn a lot from the stories that they told, but we would have to apply them in a way that works in North America or Europe, I think. Right. But it's, that's just wonderful. And it shows the value of a worldwide synod. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Yeah, beautiful reflection. Thank you for sharing. All right, we're coming up on 8:15 here. I wish we could keep this going, but I do want to respect our panelists' time. Thank you to all of you for being here, for your very wonderful and insightful remarks and comments. Ellie and Father Joe and Sister Lynn, it's been a joy to have you on this evening. And thank you to all of you for joining us and for your very fine questions. I wish we could get to more of them.